it's a pretty long journey, actually, starting from when I was 11 years old. So I'm going to try to give you the Cliff Notes version here. Basically, back then, 11 years old, I read this book called Man vs. Beast, which was a fictional book about teenage spies. But in it, one of the teenage spies, they infiltrated this supposedly like radical animal rights group. And in that, they described basically what happened in factory farms. So I remember reading this 11 years old, and I thought for sure that's part of the fiction of the book. Like, there is no way that that can be what we're doing to animals. So I did some research, I Googled factory farming, I saw footage of how animals were actually treated, and that was the start of what then became probably about a 2 or 3 year journey of going vegan. So it started with just not eating animals from factory farms. Then when I was 11 years old, I watched that episode of The Simpsons where Lisa goes vegetarian. Yeah. And that was actually the first time I'd ever even heard of vegetarianism before. So that was my motivation to go there. From there, I started getting involved with like some animal rights activism, some protests against circuses and rodeos and things in my area. I met people who were vegan, and they explained to me what happens to animals in like the dairy and the egg industries, and never looked back since then.
Wow, such a young age. How did people around you react when you started talking about these kind of subjects at such a young age?
So when I went vegetarian versus when I went vegan, those were like two completely opposite reactions. So when I went vegetarian, everyone was really supportive of that. My mom actually went vegetarian at the same time as me. So basically, like when she was growing up, she had experiences like they had a pet lamb that they got like forced to eat, for example. So she had a lot of these experiences where she had thought about the ethics of eating animals and, you know, wanted to not do that, but had just, I guess, grown up in that society where, you know, it wasn't seen as an option to do anything else. So she actually went vegetarian the same time as me. But then when I went vegan, that was an entirely different story. They thought that it was a cult. They'd never heard the word before. They thought, like, you've been brainwashed by all these hippies that you're hanging out with. And they thought I was going to just die of a calcium deficiency. So that took a little bit more convincing. I remember actually, like, when I first went vegan, I basically had to get blood tests every month to show my parents, like, look, I'm not dying. It's okay. You can do this. And now they're really supportive. A lot of my family is, like, vegetarian or vegan now. But yeah, definitely at the time and where I grew up in Hamilton, which is like dairy farming capital of New Zealand, which is like one of the dairy farming capitals of the world, definitely like, you know, more than, what would it be, 14 years ago, it was not as common as it is now.
I was going to ask you about that growing up in New Zealand, because, like, you know, as an outside perspective, you know, if I was to list the things that I know New Zealand for, that are sort of the stereotypical things that New Zealand are famous for, we talked about earlier, rugby, Lord of the Rings, and the milk industry, the dairy industry is probably quite high up there too, and probably even more so recently after the milk documentary that came out, and so on, which kind of exposed, put a spotlight on it a little bit. It would be kind of interesting to hear your perspective on that, like veganism throughout the time that you've been vegan in a country that, you know, talks about dairy and relies upon its dairy industry so heavily.
Yeah, definitely. So it's pretty like throughout the core of New Zealand culture, I guess, like everywhere across the country. But where I grew up was like even more so. It was within like the dairy farming capital of the country. So everywhere was surrounded by farms. There was actually a dairy farm that was on my high school. So it was just very normalized. Like most of the people I went to school with were like farmers or like, well, you know, children of farmers, or they were hunters and things like that. So definitely at that time, it was like considered a very strange thing to do, to be vegan. But that has changed so much in just a really short period of time. I would say these last like 3 to 4 years, it's been crazy how much that conversation has shifted.
And do you think it's, you know, obviously we're in a sort of vegan bubble, I guess, when we talk about these things, and we are, you know, really aware of, like, for example, I wonder how many folks just generally walking down the street are aware of like the Milk documentary, for example, and these kind of things. Do you see that conversation in the sort of right into the mainstream of New Zealand culture, or is it still quite a, you know, it's been talked about a lot by vegans and those who are kind of bought into that kind of ideology and that philosophy, but not necessarily on the day-to-day news and so on.
So I definitely think it has become much more part of the more mainstream conversation beyond just vegans. So there's been a couple of things that have been part of that. The milk documentary, like you mentioned, was definitely one of them recently. Another one we had a few years ago, there was a big national expose where undercover footage was released of what happened to bobby calves when they got, picked up in the trucks and taken to slaughter. And that was a national conversation at the time. That was across all of like our mainstream media outlets. And yeah, if you look at even just the sales as well, in terms of things like plant-based milks, like the numbers for all these things are just skyrocketing. So there really has been, I think, quite a wide shift, especially with dairy. And I think a lot of that, in addition to all those animal welfare concerns, it also comes from an environmental concern as well. So something like 80% of our rivers in New Zealand are considered too toxic to swim in now. And we're a country that really prides ourselves on clean and green and, supposedly taking the environmental issues really seriously. But at the same time, so much of our economy is relying on this industry that, is just decimating our natural environment and, causing deforestation and pollution and all these other things, in addition to, the obvious issue of the animal cruelty as well.
So that's really interesting to hear. So the environmental message is the one that you'd say, out of all the messaging around, all the many reasons why you would be vegan, you think that one is probably the one that resonates most with, the wider population of New Zealand?
I think it's hard to say. I think it depends a lot on the different demographics as well. I think for a lot of young people, especially, the conversations around climate change and what's our future going to look like, those probably have a lot more impact compared to say the older generations. So I think that the ethical argument, for me, that's always been why I've been vegan. It's been because of the animals. I think also there's some pretty good research that shows people who are motivated by the ethics behind it generally stick with the diet for longer. If you don't just view it as a diet, but you view it as, an ethical decision that you're making, it's definitely, you're less likely to take cheat days and things like that compared to people who are doing it because, it's healthier or it's more environmentally friendly. But I think that all of these things go together a lot. I think it's whatever reason people go vegan, it's kind of a foot in the door to all of these other issues. You might go vegan because you care about the environment and protecting it, but then once you're not actually consuming those products, it's a lot easier to be open to those ethical arguments as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one I've discussed a few times with different people, and I'm always really keen to hear their perspectives on, because I think on one hand, the sort of the vegan in me says, the definition is kind of clear, and so we should, the idea of cheat days and flexitarianism and these kind of things, something really rankles with me about those sort of concepts, because but it's against the very definition of it. You can't be part-time and so on and so forth. But on the flip side, there is an element of pragmatism that sort of says, well, if that's where people are right now, maybe they'll discover something different as they go down the path, and maybe us in the sort of vegan community, and I'm talking to myself here, need to be a little bit more okay and perhaps accepting of that, to allow people to go through that journey at their own pace.
Yeah, and I'm definitely sympathetic to both sides of that argument, really, because, as to a long-term ethical vegan for myself, I really feel that sense of urgency when you see what's happening to animals in factory farms and slaughterhouses. I understand that drive to not want to accept anything less than ending that right now. But I also think it's important to be pragmatic, like you said, as well, and to meet people where they're at and to help move them towards that world. And that same sense of urgency that drives us to act now, I think, can also, I guess, govern the way we think about effective communication strategies as well. So it's if the choices between, helping someone transition slowly and them sustaining that in the long term versus asking for all or nothing and getting nothing, I think we owe it to the animals to do what's most effective as well. So I think, like I say, I relate to both sides of it a lot because I do feel that urgency, but I also think we do need to think about, on a pragmatic level, what's the quickest road to get to animal liberation.
100%. 100%. Thinking about the quickest roads and so on and so forth and your personal journey, at what point did kind of activism come into your field of view?
So I'm probably a little bit maybe outside of the norm with vegans in this, and that animal activism for me came before I went vegan, not after. So I put a lot of this down to probably like where I grew up and veganism not being a common thing. I think that if I had kind of come across this information later when veganism was more popular, maybe it would be the other way around. But for me, it's like at each step, I thought I was like doing the best that I could for animals, right? So it's like I stopped eating factory farmed animals first because I literally thought you needed to eat meat to survive. So I thought like, well, I'll just not eat the animals that, live the worst lives. Then, going vegetarian. Again, I hadn't heard of veganism before. I didn't know what was happening to animals. So it was actually that process of getting involved in animal activism. It was when I started doing things like going to the circus protests and to the rodeo protests. That was actually how I found out about what was happening in these other industries as well.
Did you find people in those worlds were quite accepting of you being a sort of young activist, getting involved early on?
Yeah, definitely. I think people were like just, I guess, like excited to see someone that young kind of like taking these issues seriously. So definitely, I felt nothing but acceptance from inside the movement. But at the same time, I'm sure anyone who's ever been to like a circus protest or a rodeo protest knows what it's like. The other side of that, the attendees at the protest, not so much. You don't feel so welcome. Definitely, I got a lot of people telling me to get a job, which was really funny to hear at 11 years old.
Well, I was going to ask, like, what was that like meeting that kind of level of confrontation at such a young age? Like, I mean, I struggle personally with the confrontation aspect of these things now, at 38, let alone at 11. How did you find that?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess like I've never been one to enjoy confrontation. Definitely, it's never been something that I enjoy. But at the same time, I guess like that drive to try to stop like what was happening to animals, like that was stronger for me. So I guess like if somebody said something mean or whatever, I would just put it in perspective of like, okay, sure, like that's not fun to hear. But it's nothing like being an animal in one of these circuses or in these 100%. Rodeos. So I guess it was just that perspective for me.
Yeah. And how did that activism kind of evolve as you went through the journey? Sort of, you started with the kind of circus and the rodeo protest, then, like you say, you became vegan after that. And how did the kind of activism go alongside the veganism as you became deeper into the community?
Yeah, so it's definitely shifted a lot over the years. I would say in my early days, I went through what I think is basically a rite of passage for any activist, which is your angry vegan phase, where you're just mad at the world and, want to shout about what's happening from the rooftops. And so, yeah, like I used to wear like a meat is murder shirt everywhere I went, for example, and, just had like quite, I guess, an aggressive approach to the activism. Maybe not even aggressive. That's probably not the right way to phrase it, because it always came from that place of like, obviously caring about animals and wanting to create a better world. But I think it could be perceived as aggressive sometimes. It wasn't really informed by a lot of strategy around effective communication. And especially you add in a little bit of teenage angst to that picture. And, you can imagine I wasn't the most effective in my early days. So I had a few years of that and just kind of getting more and more frustrated about the fact that I wasn't seeing any results really. So it's like I was trying to speak up for animals and trying to get people to change their behavior, change, the products they were consuming to a more animal friendly way of living, but I wasn't seeing results. So what I started thinking about is basically, well, is there any research on this? So I like sort of boiled it down to, okay, what is it that we're trying to achieve? We're trying to like influence human behavior. And I thought about the fact that that's actually not something that like vegans are the first people to ever try to do. Like marketers try to do that all the time. Psychologists try to do that. So I started looking into a lot of the research in that stuff, like the psychology of behavioral change, the psychology of, consumer psychology. And what I basically started to find was that everything that I had been doing was completely backwards to what would actually change anyone's mind. So I started getting into, looking at a lot more of those studies. started like following a lot more effective activists and understanding their strategy, what was working, and that led me towards eventually working for an organization called Vegan Outreach. So we would basically hand out leaflets at university campuses about what was happening to animals, and everything about the whole way that their leaflets were designed, even the fact they focused on leafleting, it was all very data driven. It was all driven by, this research on, trying different messaging and different leaflets, seeing what had the most effect on behavior change, kind of refining over time. And I don't think I realized it at the time, but really what that was that was like marketing split testing. So it's the same idea as like if you run, say, ads on Facebook for a company. It's like you come up with a few different creatives, a few different copies, you test them on the audience, you see what works, and you keep refining from there based on the data that you're getting. And once I started taking that approach to my activism, everything changed. It just became so much more effective. The conversations were like more enjoyable too, because rather than feeling like it's me against the world, it's about like understanding how to have a like really good conversation with someone and to actually take the time to like deeply listen to them and understand what their perspective is. And when you do that, people return the favor as well.
Yeah. It'd be great to hear a couple of those sorts of things that you picked up, some of those tips that you learned early on, like you say, like listening to people's perspective, obviously, like to get started. But what kind of things stuck out for you as like, I definitely was doing this wrong and I need to do this, and then actually I'm amazed at how well this is working?
Yeah, so a big one that is very counterintuitive is like, if you want to change somebody's behavior, you have to make them think that you're not trying to change their behavior. So that so it's like, obviously as vegans, it's like we want everyone to stop eating animals, stop eating animal products, stop contributing to that industry. But if you kind of like make it clear from the outset that that's what your goal is, immediately people's guards go up and they start thinking of all the reasons they don't want to change and all the reasons to refute you. So it's like they're not even in a frame of mind where they're really taking on board anything you're saying. They're just trying to defend their current position. So what I found was that being really curious and using a lot of questions rather than say like, you could think of it like almost like a sales pitch as to like the reasons to go vegan. That was a much more effective strategy to get people to come to their own conclusions about why what was happening in these industries was wrong, rather than just telling them that it's wrong and trying to like force them to accept that it's wrong.
Did you find when you spoke to kind of other vegans, I guess you didn't, because they were probably folks who were already in vegan outreach and so on, and in organisations where they understood the same level of psychology, but there's something I'd imagine about, if you're sort of in the quote unquote vegan community and you're doing things for ethical reasons, therefore you're kind of there is a logic that might sort of follow that you're looking at every aspect of your behaviour and sort of putting it up against a benchmark and saying, do I feel comfortable with this behaviour? Did you find some folks within the sort of that vegan world, when you were saying to them, well, you need to, perhaps talk like this, and perhaps this works, and, don't try and convince people that of what your end goal is and so on. Did you find that there was any resistance to that almost, that some people sort of felt like, well, I can't do that. I don't feel sort of as pure in my, if my intentions aren't clear?
Yeah, absolutely. I have seen that resistance, and probably where I've seen it the most was in myself when I was going through this process of trying to be more effective, because I felt exactly the same way. I really thought like, because that's what had been motivating my activism that whole time. That's what had been motivating that approach was, that really strong sense that things needed to change now. And so I was just, speaking what I felt in all of my sort of like activism interactions. But like really when I boiled it down, it's like, I thought about this a lot. It's like, would I rather be right or would I rather be effective? And I thought like, to me, that's more important, the actual impact that we have for animals, the actual reality of like, how many animals can we get out of these factory farms and out of these slaughterhouses. And so I guess it was a matter of having to just like put my pride aside a little bit and like just think like, ultimately that's all of our goal as vegans. It's like what we're trying to do is create this world that's kinder to animals. And it's like, I think that, yeah, we owe it to those animals to do what it takes to achieve that.
Yeah, 100%. When did the idea of setting up your own businesses come into your equation? Was that fairly early on, or a bit later?
So before that, I spent probably about 5 years working in the nonprofit space with that role with Vegan Outreach. So I was the Australia New Zealand Outreach Coordinator. So my job was basically going to every university in both countries once every semester. We'd turn up each day, hand out maybe somewhere between 2 to 4,000 leaflets with a team of volunteers, talk to a few hundred students about veganism. And so I'd been doing this a long time and yeah, focusing on that and trying to be more effective in it. But there were two obstacles that I saw that I thought were limiting the scalability of that impact. And the first one was just the lack of funding in the nonprofit space. So the I think I saw a statistic that all of the animal rights movement's budget, like for every single charity, their entire operating budget, it doesn't even add up to something like a tenth of the marketing budget of a large corporation that uses animals, like McDonald's, for example. So it was always a big issue that impacted our ability to be more effective. It's just there wasn't enough resources in the movement to achieve everything we needed to achieve to go up against these huge industries. So I was kind of already thinking like, okay, so I need to be thinking about ways that we can bring more funding into the movement to achieve more. And the other obstacle that I noticed as well was that everything we were doing was reliant on like one-on-one interactions. So you only have so much time in the day, right? And it's like there's only so many people you can talk to one-on-one. And, you know, in a really good day, if we spent like, 10, 11 hours on a university with like 5 people volunteering, maybe we hand out a few thousand leaflets. But then we could go home on Facebook, make a post that reaches 10 times that many people overnight with, and that might only take us like 10 minutes to write that post. So I sort of started to think that the way to maximize my impact from there was to take these skills I had learned with vegan outreach and figure out a way to leverage them online so that it could reach more people and in a way that could sustain itself in terms of funding. So it would simultaneously like make money for vegan businesses while sustaining itself without having to ask for donations. And I guess with sort of like weighing up all these things, digital marketing for vegan businesses seemed like the best way to achieve that. So I went back to university, I got my degree, Bachelor of Communications, and I started Vegan Creative Compass.
Wow. So tell us about the sort of work that you do at Creative Compass.
So Vegan Creative Compass is like a vegan digital marketing agency. So we do done-for-you marketing services for vegan businesses, and we also do a pro bono program where we get animal rights charities set up with like free marketing grants, and then we basically set up their ads for a month and then give them an online course showing them how to maintain those ads going forward.
Oh, amazing. Oh, it's a great kind of idea. Did you find initially when you set it up that it was difficult to find vegan businesses, or did you actually find there was a lot more than you'd anticipated?
So I actually think there was quite an unmet need for this, to be honest. We found it very easy to get our first few clients, and then it kind of just kept growing from there. I think that one of the issues that I've seen in the agency space in general is that there's a lot of digital marketing agencies that come at it primarily from the perspective of, I guess, like being a marketing agency, and then later they try to find a niche so that they can, target a small group and be more profitable that way. And I think there were a lot of agencies that were doing that and sort of like targeting vegan businesses, but they weren't necessarily like vegans themselves, or they weren't like passionate about the cause or knowledgeable about the cause. It was kind of just like a keyword for them to use. So I think that there was really a lack of I guess people who were, doing this because they wanted to see vegan businesses succeed out of a deeper reason than just, trying to get a paycheck, but to actually make an impact on the vegan movement as a whole.
Do you think there's something sort of fundamentally lacking as well from, say, marketing agencies that try to support vegan businesses when they they're not vegan themselves. They don't necessarily have those kind of ethics. Do you think they often miss the mark with what they're sort of telling businesses to do?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's very hard to like promote brand values that you don't hold yourself. Like you can do that, but it's not going to be authentic. And so I don't think so. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons I think it's a bad idea. I think just like, like on an ethical level, I think that, you shouldn't really be marketing and trying to sell something you don't believe in. Like there should be more of a drive behind it. Cause I think marketing is like actually a very powerful thing. And a lot of people just sort of like think of it like it's just a job or whatever, but it's like marketing is changing human behavior. Like it's a very strong power, and it's something that I think people should think carefully about, like what their responsibility is with it, because marketing can really change the world for the better and for the worse. But even, that sort of thing aside, even just in terms of like the actual results, it's like if you deeply understand the audience you're marketing to because you're part of that audience, then there's no comparison of the types of results you'll get versus someone who only knows what that audience is like on a surface level, not because they're part of it.
How do you see the growth of kind of non-vegan businesses adding in vegan options and so on, and vegan, the idea, the sort of business I'm thinking of, where you have the big burger chains, say, and they add in their kind of vegan, the vegan option for January. Sometimes it persists if it does well, and so on and so forth. How do you feel about those and their marketing when you compare that with the kind of the rest of the vegan space? Do you see it as a good thing that they're in that space, and therefore they're making a big noise for all of us, which we can all kind of be on the coattails of or in the slipstream of, or actually there's a negative side to it as well?
So yeah, I guess there's pros and cons to everything, but I think on the whole, I'm very much supportive of non-vegan brands starting to bring in vegan products, and I want them to keep doing that until their whole business is vegan, right? I think like in terms of, if we think about what our goal is of this world where, animals aren't exploited for commercial reasons, it's like, I think it's going to be faster if we get there by getting some of these biggest players in the industry on our side rather than against us. If it's always just like small vegan businesses going up, like a David versus Goliath thing, then I think it's going to be much harder. Like you take Tyson is a good example of this. They've started heavily investing in like a lot of like plant-based meats and cultured meat and things like that. And they've sort of internally gone through this rebranding where they're talking about themselves as a protein company now rather than just a meat company. So it's like, if we can get that shift across the industry, like that's going to just mean so much less resistance on this path towards that vegan world. If those who traditionally would have been the biggest resistors are now actually, rebrand themselves to like, well, we actually don't care what protein we sell. We'll sell whatever the consumer's buying. It just removes so much resistance in that path.
Is there an element of greenwashing to it though, where like, and I'm just playing devil's advocate really, so you take Tyson, if they call themselves a protein business as opposed to a meat business, is there an element of them trying to green up their meat offering, which is still the majority of their profit base?
Well, I think the question there would be like, does it increase or decrease the sales of meat overall, regardless of like where that's coming from? And I don't see any reason to think that it would. So I don't think there's like, for example, people who are like ethical vegans who are going out and like buying the, plant-based chicken from Tyson and then being like, oh, well, now I'm going to buy like the actual chicken as well. Right. So most of the people that these larger companies that like aren't necessarily just vegan, they're actually not really even targeting vegans. They're targeting mostly like flexitarians, vegetarians, people trying to reduce their consumption. And so in those cases, it's like them bringing out these new products, marketing these new products. So I think a lot of the time we think like that's then has to be competing with a vegan business selling a vegan product. But in reality, I think what's actually happening is it's competing with the animal product alternative. So I think the more options there are, for consumers, the more choices they have, the more easily available those choices are, then yeah, I see it as competing against the industries that harm animals. And I think that's true also when you think about like all of the different types of products that there are. Like, there's also like we've got, plant-based meat, fermented, cultivated, all these new kind of industries coming out making alternatives. And I think there's this tendency, we naturally think that those things are competing against each other. But I actually think that like we're competing against a much wider market than that. We're competing against, people who are eating animals during every meal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that sort of, in a way, that sort of mindset, I guess, underestimates the scale of the animal agriculture industry. If if we're sort of worried about one particular aspect of a vegan product battling against another one, there's so much meat being consumed. We're talking about less, 1% of non-vegan vegan foods. So we're just trying to chip away at some a big old target insofar as what animal agriculture's doing. So I guess that sort of makes sense to me when you put it like that. Thinking about your kind of your then path, because you set up more than one business. It'd be good to sort of cover about some of the other things you're involved in, and particularly veganism in AI and AI. That those two words together, I don't necessarily have a clear path to as of yet, and I really want you to kind of help me understand.
Yeah, well, I think it's not surprising that you don't have a clear path between those two, because I guess that's what we're trying to do, is like build that path. Yeah. So I would say that the way I think about this in terms of like the progression is in the same way that, my activism became more effective when I started like, using data as the driver of that. And then like it became more effective when I started thinking about ways to fund and stuff. This is the next step in that. And I think it's a way that we can leverage data to make even better decisions on a level that's beyond what is possible for any individual human to do. So the way that artificial intelligence systems work is very similar to the neurons in our brain. So you can imagine that there's like these computer systems essentially, so there's a traditional way of how we used to code computers, which was very much just like yes, no logic kind of thing. It was like we set up, a set of rules, and in these conditions, you do this thing. Whereas the way that AI works is it's actually kind of learning for itself. So you give it like an input and then the output that's associated with that, and it starts to figure out these connections and find patterns on its own. And so the real power of it comes when you have these huge data sets that are too big for any human to comprehend, and the AI can then look for patterns. And because it's on a computer, it doesn't have like, the limited attention that humans have. It can see all of that at once and find patterns that would be impossible for us to find. So to put this like in kind of more concrete terms, it might be helpful if I give like some examples of some of the AI models that we've trained. So one that we did was we took 13,000 different scientific studies that were about veganism, animal rights, marketing, all those kind of keywords. We basically collected all these studies from the internet, and we trained an AI to go through and read those studies and break them down into a single sentence key finding for vegan businesses and animal rights activists. So it's like no human could ever do that. Like if you're going to read through 13,000 studies, like, that's going to take you the rest of your life. But then AI, that can do that overnight. And then we have suddenly something that is usable by humans, that, businesses or animal rights charities, even individual activists can start applying straight away.
Right. So it's a way to unpick large amounts of data and really understand what's going on in a kind of automated way. That's the real benefit here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that's one of the biggest benefits for sure. Yeah. It's just like in terms of like what it can do, where it can outperform humans would be that. And the other benefit I would say with it is that it's just like cheaper and faster as well. So it's like there are some tasks that AI can do that are just like it can do it better than humans can. But even the tasks that it can do, where it can do it sort of like as well as a human can, it can do it faster and it can do it cheaper.
How are vegan businesses responding to this kind of usage of AI?
Yeah, so the response has actually been a lot more than we predicted. Within the first week of the beta release, we already had more than 100 users signed up. So the model that people have been most interested in is the anti-vegan comment responder. I think that probably because like what vegan on the planet hasn't had someone comment something dumb on their Facebook at some point, right? Like we've all dealt with that. And so basically what we did is we trained this AI model on basically a bunch of responses to different anti-vegan comments. So we showed the AI like this is, the comment someone left, this is an ideal response. You do that with hundreds or thousands of examples, and eventually the AI figures out those patterns and figures out how to do that for new comments that it's never seen. So that's, I think, probably been what people have been most interested in. Also because it's just kind of like fun to use.
Yeah. There's an element of that scares me, I'll be honest. Like, scares me insofar as like, so as somebody who runs a vegan business and like, so the idea here, just so that I've got it right, so you would use that to respond to any kind of trolling and those kind of negative comments that you're getting on your social posts and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The only thing I would add to that is that it's not entirely automated. So we've done that intentionally because, I think it's important still, especially at this stage of AI development, to have a human in the loop to check over these things before they go out publicly. So it's basically like a program, like a website. You would just copy and paste the response. The AI will give you something back. If you want to use that, you can copy and paste it over, or you can edit it first. So yeah, it's still like nothing ever gets posted out automatically. I think there is definitely potential for more of that kind of thing in the future, especially the more these models train, the less mistakes they make. So what we have now is already like a fairly effective model, but it literally gets more and more powerful every time someone uses it. Because every time someone uses it, you can either upvote or downvote the response, say that was like a good response or it was a bad response, and it trains itself based on that information. Yeah. So I think it is possible that we're not far away from much more happening in terms of automation. But at this stage, everything that we do is all human in the loop. Nothing goes out until you approve it.
Well, that reassures me. What is defined as good? Because that even that term to me is like subjective. So my idea of what a good response to somebody's comment might be depends on like my stance on veganism generally. Really, whether I think an argument is a better way to go with those comments, or whether I think actually a data-driven response is good, or there's so many different ways, isn't there, to respond to something like that, and it's a bit in the eye of the beholder as to whether you think it's good. So what's the correlation between kind of good and effective in that kind of space?
I love that question. It's actually the answer to it I think is really interesting. So this is a big problem within AI more generally, is like, how do you define what is good, right? So it is subjective, and depending on how you define that is going to massively impact the type of AI model that you create. So the way we approached this with VEG3 when we did our initial training is we wanted to look at like measurable areas where we could actually like tell if something was good or bad. So it's harder to do this with something like a response to a comment. Where we can do this is something like a caption on a social media post, because we can measure how many likes did it get, how much reach did it get. We can do the same thing on like a Google ad. We can see like what was the return on the ad spend there. So in our training of all of these models, wherever there was an objective measure of what was good or bad, we use that to filter out the information we trained the AI on. So for example, the blog writing one that we have, the way we trained that was purely based around ranking for vegan keywords on Google. So we actually basically reverse engineered Google's algorithm in a sense. So like no human could really tell you, I mean, unless you're very, very deeply involved with Google, how that algorithm works and how to rank for it. But what we can do with a large enough amount of data, if we look at the way, the keywords that a blog ranks for and then the way it was written, the artificial intelligence can basically figure out how to write copy that's more likely to rank. So there's lots of examples like that where we have kind of an objective measure. At the moment, now we're in a beta test, which is, so we trained the models to sort of the best standard we could get them to with the data that we had and with, ourselves as humans given the input. And so what we're trying to do now is we're looking at the ways that vegan businesses and animal rights activists are using VEG3 and trying to make sure that it's now fine-tuned a bit more to giving them the responses that they're looking for. So it is subjective in a sense, but I guess everyone who's a part of the beta test at the moment is sort of like gets to play a role in that. So our hope is that we can kind of, so we train it for the subjective function, and in the subjective function now, we train that across a wide, diverse range of people with all of their different ideas about subjectively what's good and bad, that are still, going in the same direction. They're still motivated by that same idea to help animals. But yeah, we bring in more, I guess, diversity and subjective opinions on these things to hopefully make a model that's now better for whatever people want to use it for across that sort of diverse range.
I don't know if this is a too naive a question, but I'll chuck it in there anyway,
No,
or a thought process. But if there's a sort of a fear in me over like social media generally, and I think about how I promote my own business or how I promote the podcast, for example, and there's kind of ways that I don't know if I know, but there's ways that I've seen that are effective that I don't want to do.
Yeah.
As a business owner, as a podcast host, as these kind of things, there's kind of there's things I could do in my posts that I know would do better, in the algorithms, and I know would if I, for example, like if I inflame a little bit more of the I put an inflamed viewpoint out there, I'm going to get more response to it. I'm going to get more engagement and so on and so forth. And I don't do that because I don't want to. Is there scope for that? And forgive me if you've kind of already answered that. But I am really, really green when it comes to this stuff. Is there scope for you as a business owner to be able to manage your message how you want to? Because there might be two posts, say that post is going to get me 1,000 likes and that post is going to get me 100, but that one is the 100 people that I want, because those 100 people are my people with my way of thinking, whereas those 1,000 people are not necessarily who I want to be talking to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And it's a really good question, and something that is a real big issue on social media with like the way that the algorithms work to only kind of work to try to maximize engagement. And I think that actually does cause a lot of like social issues as well, because what happens when the most offensive, most enraging posts are the most engaging, suddenly you have an algorithm that's optimized for trying to make people mad, and that's obviously like not what you want. So I think that to me demonstrates the importance of human in the loop when it comes to training AI systems. So like this is a problem with like if you are setting like an optimization goal, I guess, for a machine that doesn't understand all of these nuances of the complexities of being human, and it's just trying to optimize for a single goal. So I think that's why it's really important to have someone in that process who is like manually reviewing these things as well. So for example, like at the moment during our beta testing phase, like when people are upvoting and downvoting responses, all of those get manually reviewed before they get fed into the AI as well. So it's like a way to sort of speed up that process from the user perspective, but humans are like reviewing these things as well, and not just like hoping for the best. So yeah, I think it is honestly like one of the biggest challenges is, I think, for AI systems in general is like, what do you optimize for? And yeah, because there's all sorts of unintended consequences if you blindly optimize for one thing. So yeah, I would say the answer to that is having a human in the loop and also testing the models regularly as well, and making sure that they're not having these like, unintended results. And that's why, like, with where VG3 is at the moment, we make sure that basically nothing is automated. So like nothing will go out until a human has actually reviewed it. So we also thought about this a lot when we were training the blog writing models, because basically, like, it would have been possible if we had wanted to. We could have created a model where you literally just put in the SEO keywords and it writes an entire blog and posts it for you straight away. Like that, we had the data and the software to be able to do that, but we intentionally decided to break it down into two separate models. One that creates an outline for your blog, so like headline and then various subheadings, and another where you use those two to create your paragraphs. And we did that because we wanted people to actually be reading what the AI is creating, checking over it, making sure that it fits with their brand voice, maybe regenerating paragraphs if they don't, rather than just having it, all done in one go, and then people post out 10,000 of those without reading them.
It's just incredible. The whole thing's mind blowing to me, and even the human in the loop bit makes me think, okay, I trust it when you're the human in the loop, and your business is the human in the loop, and then it makes me think about Elon Musk being the human in the loop in, say, Twitter, or and I appreciate there's people who work for him, but people work for him with that ideology. And yeah, just the whole concept sort of, there's still some, I guess, like with anything new like this, it's being written, and when it's being written and there are people involved in it, we have to look at their intentions and whether we want to be with those folks or not with those folks, whether we agree with them, we disagree with them, so on and so forth, and put our sort of chips where we want to put our put our faith. So I'm kind of pleased you're in this space, if I'm honest.
I appreciate that. I think it's that concern though is not unique to AI. I would say that concern is the same with any new technology that is more powerful than what came before it. So like, the way I see it is that all of these new technologies are just tools. They're not good or bad in themselves. They just increase the impact of whatever it is you're trying to do with that tool, right? So the analogy that I like to use is a sledgehammer. So imagine with a sledgehammer, you could build an orphanage with that and create, some really great impact, or you could smash your grandma's head in with it and do something really horrible. It's not that the tool itself is good or bad, it's purely what you're doing with it. And I think AI is a very, very powerful tool, and definitely in the wrong hands, I think it can do a lot of damage. And I think increasingly more, we're going to have conversations as a society about how we regulate these things as well, and how we make sure that these tools are being used for the right reasons. Because, if you think about, again, like the way they work in terms of just optimizing for a function, it's like, if that function we were all optimizing for was a kinder, better, more abundant world, like how great would that world be if we had, AI systems that were all devoted to that? But if we have AI systems that are devoted to, how can I get the most ad revenue at any cost, regardless of anything else, it's going to be a very different world.
Sam, it's been an absolute education. I've learned lots, and I have lots to think about from chatting with you. I really do appreciate it. Where can folks go to find out a little bit more about what you're doing with VG3, Creative Compass, so on and so forth?
So the best place to go would be to VegCatalyst.com. That's the parent company for all of these different brands. So you can find all of the links to social media and to the different sites there.
Amazing. I'm going to pop them all in the show notes as well, so folks can go and explore, and I'd encourage them to as well. So thanks so much, Sam. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great speaking to you. Thanks for the time.